Let me have you look up for just a moment so we can get our memory verse done. This is the last week of this particular verse. We will begin a new verse. Probably not next week. I think I'll give you a week off for memory verses because I'm just a nice guy. I'm just the nicest guy you know. Or at least the guy's just nice. I think so anyway. So Galatians chapter 4. Pick it up in verses 4 and 5. But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. So not bad. It's 2 verses, I know that, but I know you can do that. We'll start a new one probably on the, what is this going to be, the 13th, I guess. So we'll do that. Christmas time, and really at any time, it's easy for us to conflate needs and wants. You ever found yourself there? It's not that we don't know the difference between a need and a want. We understand the conceptual difference between them, but at Christmas time especially, it gets a little bit muddy when we start working on a Christmas list, right? You start working on a Christmas list, what do I need? And what you end up with is not a list of things that you need. What you end up with is a list of things that you want. And my list is no different than yours. It may have weirder things on it, but it's still what I want, not what I need. That's just the way Christmas rolls. But it's easy in our minds to confuse that, to say, I need this, I need this, I need this, because, the commercials that TV, radio, internet, everybody has these days is that you need this. When it's really, you want this, because need is a whole different thing. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just let me be clear there. There's nothing wrong to have a wish list, a list of things that you want, and to put that out there to Santa and say, hey, here's what I want. Take it or leave it, but this is what I want. Leaving Christmas lists aside for just a moment, there are times in our lives when we have legitimate needs. There are times when we have legitimate physical needs. We have need of food or clothing or shelter or the need to provide those for other people. There are times in our lives where we have non-physical needs, where we think about identity or purpose or significance and the ability to provide those things for other people. We have legitimate, genuine needs at times. In moments of our great needs, in moments of our greatest need, we have one great fear as we face need. And the fear that we always have, and it's not rational because fear by its nature is not rational, but the fear that we have when we have a moment of need is that no one can provide that need. And sometimes we go so far as to say no one even recognizes that need, let alone has the ability or the desire to meet it. There's something in that moment of need that is very isolating to us. And that's kind of a dark place to be. And if you've ever been in a time of great need, you can kind of remember that experience, remember that feeling, that sudden burst of despair. It's not rational. But we begin to think, nobody knows I need this, or nobody cares I need this, or nobody can meet this need. And that is a horrible, terrible, no good place to be. Now that fear, it's irrational, and it's also generally unfounded. Because there is at least one who knows, who cares, who is willing and able to meet the needs that we have. From a divine perspective, God knows everything. He knows our needs. And He's willing and able to meet those needs. And from a human perspective, usually we find that there are people around us who know our needs and are willing to help us as well. Christmas time and the Christmas stories especially provide almost endless interest to us. You know, it's one of the things I on the one hand I struggle with, and the other hand I feel like there's just more. How do you keep doing the same stories year over year over year? You know, it's like, how many times can you hit the same 2 or 3 chapters of the Bible and keep it interesting, keep it fresh? And this year, I've just been pushing at the Christmas stories, and what I found is a lot of interest and a lot of information for us, but they speak to the moments of need that we have. And that's especially true where I have you this morning in Matthew chapter 2. As we look at the wise men, we see in this story, even as we're kind of closing out the Christmas season, we see in this story how they speak, their story speaks into our need and the provision that awaits us. So I want to read this morning Matthew chapter 2. I want to read verses 1 all the way down to verse 15. And just read through it kind of without comment. We'll come back and pick the whole thing. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the young child. And when you have found him, bring back word to me, that I may come and worship him also. When they heard the king, they departed. And behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented to him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed for their own country another way. Now when they departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt I called my son. Now, this story on the surface is pretty straightforward. There are some details that we could maybe think about. But there are generally, despite the straightforward nature of the story, a couple of questions that typically emerge out of the story. And then when we start to push at this story, there's a few more questions that will actually bubble to the surface. And so this morning, I just want to kind of go through rapidly and see if I can hit the major questions. And then if you get to the end and, I missed your question, write it down, let me know, and I'll see what we can do. But I want to get through the questions that usually appear in the story. The first question is, who were the wise men? Who were these wise guys? Some of your Bibles will say kings. The song certainly does. Some of your Bibles will say magi or something like that. This answer is really one of the easier ones to answer. The word that's actually used here, the Greek word that's translated wise men or magi or kings, is actually the Greek word magoi, which is a term that originally applied to Persian priests. This had a very specific usage in the time that this was written. It referred to Persian priests. So Persian priests, what we know about them, they're from, obviously, Persia, which conveniently is to the east of Jerusalem. And so they're from the east. Persian priests were an entire caste within the Persian Empire, within the Persian people. They were incredibly well studied, well learned. They were generally fairly wealthy, lived comfortable lifestyles or comfortable lives, generally on the king's dime. So whenever you're kind of on the state till, that's usually not a bad place to be. Though they were a caste, they drew from other areas. So you could become a wise man or a magi or a magoi. The Persians were less structured in their caste system than, say, India and some other places where you're locked in a caste. For instance, probably the most well-known of these Persian priests to us is a guy named Daniel. Recognize that name? Author of the book of Daniel, conveniently enough. Daniel started his life as a Jewish noble. If you'll remember the kind of the history goes, he was abducted by the Babylonians when they came in, and he was brought into their training programs. The Babylonians and Persians were much alike in this. He rose through the ranks in Babylon. Later, he would move and rise through the ranks of the Persian Empire to become one of their most influential priests, one of these guys. And so he would have been there. In fact, his kind of notable work, the book of Daniel, probably written in Persia, definitely housed in the libraries of Persia. It's no surprise then that Persians who were well studied would find or would read his scroll, study it, and be able to determine that Messiah was coming. So when we think about who were the wise men, historically we can figure out kind of where they came from and who they were and how they even knew to be looking. Second question, what was the star the wise men saw? Let me just tell you right off, the short answer is no clue. We don't know. Here's what we do know. The wise men, these magi or magoi, they studied all of the arcane arts, including and especially astrology. They were students of the night sky. When stuff went bump in the night sky, they saw it, they knew it, they had records, they had charts, they had you name it. And so what we can see in this particular text is that the star appeared, which means at some point it wasn't there and then it was. And then we also find the star moved, at least from the wise men's perspective, as they studied the night sky. What does that mean for us? No idea. We really don't know. It hasn't stopped people from proposing, oh, it was this star, it was that star, it was a comet, it was a cupid, it was a donner, it was a dancer. We don't know. It could have been several things that are possible. It could have been God went, boop, poke the night sky, create a hole, drag the hole. We don't know. It could have been completely special occasion. We simply don't know the answer to that. What we do know is that the star was prophesied. Numbers chapter 24 and verse 17, Isaiah chapter 60 verse 3 talks about light, talks about a star. And so the star was instructive to them in their studies. God communicated with them in a way they could understand. And it was something that was in fulfillment of the Scripture. Beyond that, we don't really know. So you can just write, I don't know, next to that one, and you'd be as well along as anybody. Here's one. How old was Jesus when the wise men visited? Now, here's where we all get hung up. As you read this text, several times Matthew uses the phrase young child. And we begin to think in our minds that baby and young child are two different things, which they can be, but they don't have to be, in English or in Greek. The word that's used in either place can refer to a newborn, an infant, a toddler, somewhere up to about 5, 6 years old, that young child. Like 5 and under, it all fits. And so don't get hung up on this phrase, young child. Here's what we do know about this. Joseph and Mary were in Bethlehem. They're there because they were required by law to be there. But the law didn't say, go home to your ancestral home and stay there. It's a go, register, and then get back on with your life, right? And so what we do know is that while there was no housing available the night that Joseph and Mary showed up in Bethlehem, very soon after that, there was. And Joseph, as a responsible husband and father, would have secured and would have been able to secure housing pretty rapidly, within probably days, max, we're talking. So when we think about these guys showing up to a house, well, duh, Joseph's going to find a house. He's not going to just like stay homeless with his wife and baby if he can help it. So he finds a house and he's called a young child. In all likelihood, when we start mapping out the time of Jesus' life and all of the things that we do know, in all probability, Jesus was still a newborn at the point that the Magi show up. So don't let, this idea, he uses the term young child. Matthew doesn't use any other term. We find in the book of John, actually, the same word being used for a newborn baby, young child. The same term applies. So it does go either way. So don't make too much of that. Bottom line, Jesus was probably still a newborn. Which brings us to the next question. What were the gifts? Now, we sang about them, so you could probably tell me right off the top of your head, right? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Any idea what those things are? Oh, yeah, we know what gold is. Gold, we got covered, baby. We understand what gold is. So we'll skip over gold, except to say, as the song kind of mentioned, that gold is the tribute that you offer to a king. So frankincense. Now, what is frankincense? Frankincense is dried resin from a tree, sometimes called the frankincense tree. But it's just that resin, that gum, that icky stuff that it dries out, that is then ground and burned as incense. And so frankincense, that's kind of the clue. This is something, it's a tree resin that's used in incense. And as tribute goes, it's the kind of tribute that you offer to a god. It is expensive. Frankincense, you think about it, okay, it's just incense, great. Frankincense actually was probably as valuable as the gold. It was a rare commodity. It was used in high-end religious worship kind of a deal. And so this was absolutely appropriate tribute to offer a god, something of quite a bit of value, though. And then finally brings us to myrrh. Myrrh, like frankincense, actually comes from a tree resin. It's dried out. It comes from a different type of tree. Myrrh was used throughout the ancient world. Had several different uses. First of all, it was very aromatic. And so it was often used in perfuming. And you think about it, high-end perfume equals what? Expensive, right? You get a good perfume, it's expensive. And so, the myrrh would be ground and mixed with oils and whatever else perfumers use, and it would be used in that. It was used because of its aromatic qualities. It was used for embalming because it really could overpower even the stench of death. It was especially used for this, notably enough, in Egypt was a place that myrrh was used. Myrrh was also had astringent qualities, and so it was used for treating wounds and kind of stanching blood flow, and it also had pain-killing properties. And so it's the kind of thing where you could rub it onto a wound topically, or you could take it internally. You could use it either way as a painkiller. A lot of uses myrrh had. Bless you. It was the kind of offering that was suitable, kind of tribute that was suitable to one who was going to be a sacrifice. Of the three things here, myrrh actually may have been the most valuable. We think about these gifts and we think, oh, incense and myrrh, great. Myrrh, equally rare like frankincense, but in higher demand and of probably greater value than the gold. Now, we don't know how much of each of these things was given. Like there was obviously no accountant with these guys. Somebody to say, here's the tally sheet, here's how it ties out. But what we do know is they came bearing treasures fit for a king. Now, if you're going to travel literally halfway around the world, not quite, but quite a bit, You're going to spend months traveling to bring tribute to a king. Are you bringing one gold coin and like 1 grain of these other things? You're bringing several, probably a fair bit. We don't stop and think of it very often, but if we were to take the value of gold and the value of myrrh and the value of frankincense and assume that they came in a fair bit of quantity, what Joseph and Mary received from these wise men in today's dollars was somewhere around $1 million. Let that sink in for a second. That's a big gift. That's a, and it's a guesstimate. Admittedly, it's a guesstimate. But you're thinking right now, gold is somewhere around $4,000 an ounce, give or take. It's up there. It's expensive. You think 16 ounces of gold, that starts to get expensive quickly. Frankincense being as valuable, but myrrh being more valuable. This is not a small gift that the wise men imparted to Joseph and Mary. It was somewhere in the area of $1 million. Now, brings us to the next question. Why did Joseph and Mary need that much money? Why did they need that much wealth given to them at this moment? And you think about it, the answers aren't real hard to figure out because, first of all, they're living at the moment in Bethlehem. Where are they from? Galilee. They're from Nazareth. They're from a whole different region, different town. They're, literally 120, 150 miles away, which when you're talking about on foot, let's add a zero. It's like 1,000 miles in our terms. They're a long way from home. They're a long way from their jobs. They're a long way from their support systems. They're here. They have a newborn baby. They've got a house. It's not their house. They're having to pay for. No job, no income. They need wealth. What's getting ready to happen to them? We learn in the text, they're getting ready to flee to Egypt. Myrrh would have been incredibly helpful in Egypt, don't you think? That's where it was used a lot of. But they're getting ready to have to travel and live on the run for a while. The angel says, go to Egypt and stay there until I tell you to come back. So they were there for a little while. They were going to need income. They were going to need income to make that trip. They were going to need supplies. They were going to need housing when they got there. They were going to need to be there for a while, but not set roots in too deeply because when the angel said come home, they needed to go back to Nazareth. They were going to need some income. So they had some income. God knew the need they were getting ready to have, and he made sure they had it. But it kind of begs the question. The next question kind of follows on. Why did the wise men come at all? You could make the argument that had the wise men not showed up, that Herod wouldn't have known about Jesus, and Mary and Joseph could have gone home rather than going to Egypt. Why did the wise men come at all? And there's actually several facets to this answer, several elements to the answer. The first one is among the most important. They wanted to worship Jesus. So did they need to come? Yeah, they wanted to worship Jesus. Their search was genuine. Jesus would later say in Luke chapter 7, and I have the absolute wrong verse. That was sweet. Anyway, Jesus said in Luke, he said that those who seek me will find me. He said, knock and the door shall be answered. Seek and you will find. The promise that God has always given is when we genuinely want to be in relationship with God, when we want to worship Him, our knowledge or lack thereof, our closeness or lack thereof, our obstacles that we face, God will overcome them. The fact that the wise men wanted to worship Jesus was enough for God literally to move time and space to make sure they could. And so that's the first and biggest reason. Why did the wise men have to come? Because they legitimately wanted to worship Jesus, and when we want to worship God, we'll make a way. But secondly, they needed to fulfill prophecy. Both the prophecies about the star and the prophecies about Jesus' return from Egypt had to be fulfilled. And so their arrival facilitated that. It made us aware that the star was there. It set in motion a series of events that would lead to Joseph and Mary having to flee to Egypt and then God having to call his son from Egypt. And so prophecy had to be fulfilled, and they actually facilitated that. But thirdly, they also provided introduction. We think about it, the Christmas story, we have angels singing in the night sky. Who are they introducing Jesus to? Shepherds, right? So the shepherds, they come running into Bethlehem, loud Scrabble bunch that they are. They come running into Bethlehem. They finally find, not on their first attempt, I think, they find Mary and Joseph and Jesus, and then they leave, and what do? They tell everybody. They already woke the town up, so might as well just let them know the good news, right? They go out, and they're telling everybody what they had just encountered. And so the angels introduced Jesus or announced Jesus' birth to the shepherds. The shepherds announced Jesus' birth to the people around Bethlehem. But it was just the common people in Bethlehem. 4 or 5 miles away from Bethlehem was another city. A city filled with religiously important people, politically important people who had no idea that Jesus was born. Who was it that announced Jesus' birth to the religious leaders and the political leaders? It was the wise men. You needed people who could speak the language of religion and speak the language of politics to introduce Jesus to those people. And so the wise men fulfilled that role. They provided the introduction. And that's most of the questions we get through. Here's the one that I came across. And this one I found it interesting. I was pushing at the story. Who was Matthew's source? I didn't skip any questions, did I? Not really paying attention to what's going up here. Who was Matthew's source? You think about it for a second. Now, Jesus was about 30 years old when he and Matthew met. So the events in this story were about 30 years after Matthew comes on the scene. How many of these details did Jesus know? Humanly speaking, I understand Jesus is God and he knows everything. Just bifurcate your mind for just a moment there. And how many of these details did Jesus know? Probably not all of them. So who was Matthew's source? Well, you think about it. Herod was dead, not him. Joseph was dead, couldn't have been him. Jesus, Mary, possibility. Luke interviewed Mary clearly for some of his work, but the details that are in the story, I don't think Mary would have known. You start pushing at this, and there are two kind of candidates emerge in my mind. The first candidate is somebody from Herod's household. Because you think about it there, we're told, Matthew tells us, that Herod called the wise men secretly or privately. It wasn't a big show, it was a private audience. There were very few people who knew that audience took place. Herod knew, but he was dead. Herod would have had a few people in his household that would have known, though many of them were dead because Herod had a habit of killing his own staff. And there's one other person or people that would have known. The wise men. You think about this story, who knew all of the details in the story, and where does the focal point of the story, the perspective of the story, is very much the wise men's perspective. It's the wise men's experience. The star, the traveling, the meeting with Herod, the secret meeting with Herod, the moving star. Who would have known the star moved? Well, the wise men did. They were the ones studying the night sky to begin with. Who were the ones who knew what the treasures were? Who are the ones that knew that an angel visited them and sent them home a different way? That's not information you tell a newborn's mother. Oh, by the way, the king's coming to kill you, so we're going to go home this way. That's just, proceed with caution with new mothers. Yes? Gentlemen? Anyone? Does it make sense? This is my personal theory. But I happen to think that Matthew may have run into one of those wise men later on. Probably in Israel, not in Persia. And got this account from them. It fits, doesn't it? You say, I got another idea. Fantastic. I'll hear it. But none of the other writers of the Gospels mention the story at all. I don't think the other disciples were, at least initially, privy to this story. Somehow Matthew met this guy and was able to get details. That's just the coolest thing. For me, this is the cool part. Like, oh, I never thought of that before, because honestly, I hadn't. Till very recently. That is very interesting. When we start pushing at this story, like any other text in the Bible, it gets even more interesting. You begin to push at it, and you begin to say things, and you begin to ask questions that you didn't have before. It makes the Bible's text more interesting, easily understood by every child in the room, but enough to keep our curious minds spinning, isn't it? But we want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the heart of this story. The heart of this story is provision. God sees and God provides. God saw the wise men. God saw Joseph and Mary. God saw the religious leaders. God even saw you and I. You see, Joseph and Mary had real physical needs. They needed provision, those basic needs, food, clothing, shelter. They had those needs. God saw that need, and God actually foresaw that need and provided, and not just a little bit. You know, if you ever had a need and God wrote you a check for $1 million, that's not bad. God saw their physical need, and He provided. Notice, though, how did God provide? Through someone else. God frequently, almost always, He doesn't just sweep gold dust down and we just starts raining gold. That would be awesome. But usually when God provides, He does it through someone else. There's a lesson there as well. But God saw Joseph and Mary's need, and He provided. God saw the political and religious leaders' need. They needed to know Messiah had arrived. And God provided that knowledge to them through the wise men. The wise men needed Jesus. And God provided that through a star that they could find and follow. We need the Bible to engage us at varying levels. We need the simplicity of a cool story, of a song. And we need the complexity of a story that can continue to challenge our minds as we begin to try to think through the details of what was it, what happened, how do we know? And God provided us a Bible that engages us on all of those levels. The story is all about provision. So the next time that you have a need, think about this story. Rather than getting despondent and desperate, and isolated, thinking that nobody knows and nobody cares and nobody can, remember that God sees, that God knows, and God provides. So when you have a need, take really 3 concrete actions. Ready? First one is this. Ask. Say, doesn't God know what I need? Yes, God knows what you need. But like all fathers, every once in a while, He likes to hear you say it. Right? Every once in a while, you want your kids to ask for things that they need. Now, it's not that you're not already providing 99 and 44/100% of everything else. But every once in a while, it's nice to hear, hey, Dad, I need this. Hey, Dad, can you get that? And God's a father. So when you have a need, ask. Maybe God's just waiting for you to say it. And He'll hold it until you do. Because that's how fathers work. Secondly, trust. When you have a need, trust. Believe that God can and will provide what you need. He literally orchestrated time and space to make sure the wise men had their needs met. What if Daniel hadn't gone to Persia? You think about how many events, how many threads had to be woven together for the wise men even to have access to the book of Daniel. To know that a Messiah was coming. To know to look heavenward for that sign. God literally moved time and space to provide their need. So how hard is it for Him to meet yours? I mean, that need was 1,000 years in the making. Or that provision was 1,000 years in the making. And He's doing that all the time for all of us, weaving together the tapestry of our lives in ways that we will never fathom, so that our needs are met. Ask, trust, and thirdly, give. Because God most frequently meets our needs through others, we need to be careful to give to the people around us, because that's how God is going to meet their needs. So maybe you can't do that in a time of your need, but when you're flush, that's when you can give. When you are blessed, that's when you can give. When you have all of your needs met and there's a little bit left over, you can hoard it or you can give and help. But God most frequently meets the needs of others through us. And God most frequently meets our needs through others. That's why we do life together. Sometimes we get either too ashamed to ask or too proud, and both are pretty, because that's how we stayed and stuck in need. Ask, trust, give. But the heart of the story of the wise man is about provision. God sees, God provides. Father, we love you. I'm thankful for this story. I'm thankful for these wise men who were wise enough to seek you and to see you in the answer that you had provided for them. Father, may we be reminded in pushing at this text of asking questions, that at every turn we see needs presented and we see provision extended. Help us in our time of need, in our times of need, to ask. Help us to trust. Help us to receive and to recognize the provision that you make. And then, Father, in times where we have fewer needs, would you help us to remember to look around us to see where we can extend help to others. Thank you for that in Jesus' good name.